Kristina, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I've been waiting to say this. Breaking news. Okay, not really, but we do have new research. I invited Kristina because you see patterns the rest of us feel, and you're going to bring fresh findings of AI in GTM. And that's a thing we're all struggling with. Where is that opportunity to bring AI into our GTM? So to kick us off, if you had to write a headline for GTM right now, right? And right now used to be a year, month. Right now is in like a week, hour. But Kristina, if you had to write a headline for right now, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, it would be that everybody's using AI. So if you're not, it's time to catch up.
Everyone is using it. Time to catch up. And are they catching up? Are folks that you're interacting with able to keep up?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of really cool things on the individual level. I think it's safe to say that pretty much everyone I talk to is using AI in some way. They just may not be using it as frequently as others. And so the big push for a lot of folks is how to professionalize their use of AI and think about using it in different areas of their role, other than some of the standard looking up stuff or research types of use cases.
So today we're going to talk about how B2B teams are actually adopting it. And you've got a pretty unique perspective. Could you share what your perspective is and a little bit about the research before we dive in? Our goal today is going to be, for those listening, you walk away with some very practical things that you can implement.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think I'm lucky in that I have a unique perch while this is unfolding. I'm currently an EIR at Scale Venture Partners. That's an executive in residence, but my particular remit is to focus on helping our portfolio companies, over 60 plus companies, figure out how to leverage AI in their go-to-market motions. And so I get to see what a lot of different folks are doing on a lot of different levels, where it's working and where it's not.
That's like really cool. And that makes sense. I've seen that role before. It seems like once your portfolio gets over a certain number of companies, this is one of those risks you want to try to minimize as much as you can, right?
Absolutely. It's about maximizing the investment and hopefully increasing the speed of scale that the different organizations can achieve. And so the research that we're doing, a lot of folks out there are doing research on AI. We're not unique in that. But what we're trying to do that's different is we're really trying to focus on the users, the use cases, and where things are working. And so the research we conducted looked at hundreds of go-to-market organizations of varying sizes, focused on B2B, sales, marketing, sales development, and customer success leaders to really understand, again, who's using it, how they're using it, where they're seeing the benefits, and how do we want to think about what's next.
I just want to hear it all. So we've got a choice to make. We can either deliver the most value in the beginning of the episode and then kind of work our way down, or the opposite, encourage for those listening to start with, Kristina, you decide, and you don't even have to tell us, but start walking us through what is it that you're seeing? What are the patterns?
Yeah, I think one of the first that is kind of interesting and unique is as we look at who's adopted, and I'm looking at the scale of adoption in each functional area, we're seeing that marketers are outpacing the adoption of other functions. I think that's probably because of a couple of reasons. Marketing is very well versed in how to adopt new technology. We saw that with the rise of the marketing stack. That sort of was a precursor to the rise of the sales stack. But also many of the core fundamental role responsibilities that marketers have align very, very well for AI to optimize. Things like content generation, things like creating assets for different campaigns once you have sort of an initial campaign idea. These are things that AI does very, very well. And so I think that it's a combination of the fact that marketing has always been very bullish on technology, very experimental with new technologies, as well as the jobs to be done are very aligned to what AI capabilities have been over the last 2 years. I think we're starting to see that shift as new capabilities come with the models, that we're going to see more and more use cases unlocking for other functional areas. But marketing is kind of leading the charge. Fast on its heels is actually sales development, which is somewhat surprising, maybe not, to different folks in that, again, a good substantial part of the SDR role lends itself to what AI has been very, very good at for the last 12 to 18 months. Things like doing research, things like customizing messaging, and doing that over and over and over and over again across a high volume of activities. So I have a hypothesis that this is why we are seeing those two functions lead the charge. And then the other functions like sales and customer success, we are seeing great usage. I think sales leaders, sales teams in general are over 60% using. Customer success is lagging behind, but again, we've seen that with other technology evolutions. And I think that for both of those teams, it's because we have, well, two things. The stakes are so much higher. Like once deals progress further down the pipeline, we're a little more careful about where we experiment with those deals because we don't want to mess them up. Same goes on the customer side. Once we've got those customers, we want to be very careful about how we interact with them so we don't do anything to mess up that relationship. And so it's not a bad thing that it's been slower to adopt. It's just that as we learn in other use cases, we're laying the tracks to build the trust and the credibility to extend those use cases further down the funnel. The other thing too is there's just a lot more people in sales and customer success. One could argue also in sales development, such that the rate of change is just going to take a little bit longer. As we think about in marketing, we've got just fewer headcount than we do in sales. And so getting those people up to speed, coaching those folks, helping them iterate on the use cases, it's just a little less wiry, if you will, because there's just less folks involved. But getting a rep to do something differently after they've figured out the recipe that works, that's just going to inherently take longer and more enablement. And so it's not surprising that that's happening, but I think it's interesting because we can learn from the use cases of marketing and sales development who might be moving faster and pushing the envelope, and also be thoughtful about how we apply those to those that are coming behind.
And it makes sense. If something is working, why mess with it? Right? That's kind of the first impulse. Although there's good reasons why mess with it is because you can always do better. You can continue to improve.
Yes. I think one thing I'll comment on that is interesting is we've seen with AI and a lot of different AI solution providers out there that sort of the first wave did this hand-wavy save your reps time as the ROI that we wanted to recognize. And while we all logically agree that it is important to increase productivity and to save time, it's been very hard to measure. And so the teams that I'm seeing actually get benefit from those earliest use cases are the ones that have sat down and had a good understanding of what it is that they do today, how long it takes, maybe done things like time studies to document and quantify that, and then be able to articulate better how those productivity increases are happening. So one organization that we've talked to set a goal early on after they did time studies to save each rep 10 hours a week. That's a pretty lofty goal, but as they started trying lots of different experimental use cases, they could see that this one saves them half an hour, this one saves them 2 hours, and they can get to where they over time can save 10 hours a week. Now, the other thing that we have to consider is what are they going to do with that 10 hours? G2 just published some great research by Tim Sanders, their Chief Innovation Officer, on articulating the challenges is that when we free up time for people, what tends to happen is that time kind of gets wasted. It doesn't get repurposed as much as we think it will. And there's sort of thinking behind this. There's a theory called Parkinson's law that people will take the allotted time to get a task done. So even if we make that easier on them and they get it done in half the time, they're sort of still going to take that full time, and it just ends up that they waste more time. And so thinking about how we move those goalposts sooner and sooner so that we, when we save them time and it takes less time, they're now on to the next thing is an important factor to keep in mind.
Oh, there was so much you said there that's brilliant that I want to unpack. Well, let me go to what you said about experimentation and tell me if you see it differently. But AI is not magic. There's a lot of YouTube videos about, hey, just do this and everything just magically works. Those videos are beautifully designed and are entertaining to watch. And then there's the real life. So maybe speak a little bit about what you're learning of the lift it takes to get to the value.
Yeah. I have so many folks who have come to me and said, great, can you just write a course or write down all the best practices, just document it out for me. And my answer is usually, I could do that, but you won't use it. And so what's more important is I actually do a lot of shoulder to shoulder because I think more folks are waking up to this as well. But when a person gets their hands into a model and starts iterating with it and starts understanding that back and forth, that's when the magic really happens around adoption. That's when they start thinking about things like, oh, if I just applied it to this other thing, and then this other thing, and then this other thing. And so that experimentation cannot be skipped for each individual to start understanding how to leverage AI best. Organizations have to go through it. I've seen several teams actually bring in folks to do workshops where there are lots of hands-on activities to help team members understand. Because then once you understand what that back and forth looks like, then they can start to imagine if. Like imagine if we applied this to our campaign analysis. Imagine if we applied this to this, very rudimentary manual workflow. Like then they can start imagining those things, but you can't skip that process. I think that's really clear. But then also there are a lot of folks that are realizing after they've gone down that path that they need to sort of back up and really think about what their core underlying process is. AI cannot solve for a thing that it does not have guidance or guardrails to solve for. And so you can throw anything into AI and you can get an answer out. It might not be a helpful answer. What makes it more helpful for organizations is when we do things like we put our playbook in, we put our documented processes in, we put in our existing performance, and then we use AI to help us understand blind spots, help us understand opportunities, help us understand improvements. And so I think that process element, we used to say it all the time, with the other tech evolutions, MarTech and then the sales tech evolution, process before tech. And the same applies to AI, process before tech.
The people, process, technology. Maybe before we talk about what else you see working, let's talk about maybe some of the things that are not working or the challenges that are out there. Like, for example, I know from my personal use in observing our teams, if you think every task goes into AI and it's always AI Pro as an example, you're sitting there waiting for 10 minutes, then you run it again, then you run it again. By the time it's finished, you've just burned an hour, but also you feel exhausted because you're sitting waiting. Or do you switch context and you go work on something else? A messy world emerges. So maybe what are some of the things that are not working, that are burning down people and processes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I just talked about how everybody needs to get their hands in to have this fundamental basic understanding. I do think that's really important, but not everybody needs to be running all the experiments at the same time. So we're seeing in our research that certainly when there's top-down initiatives from the C-suite, that's driving progress with AI, even more so if we have functional leadership bought in and driving that. But where we see the most impact occurring is when you've got RevOps involved. And that's because RevOps is used to the frameworks and structure around experimenting with tech, which the rest of the organization doesn't always have. So where I'm seeing it not work as well is when we have teams doing sort of spot experiments and then not sure how to operationalize that across the rest of the org. Or doing something that maybe is a little bit out over their skis technically, and then that pilot gets dropped because they reach the limits. And so figuring out how to pool some of that intelligence, usually through RevOps, so that you have that full funnel perspective, as well as some of the technical expertise to be able to take those use cases farther and or into full operation is really important. So it's really critical that each individual knows the basics of how to interact with the models, but then from there, we need to have that team that is responsible for setting the strategy, for picking which use cases are worth it, because while there are 1,500 things you could apply AI to, there's probably 5 that would materially unblock the team's performance. And so figuring out how to identify those, prioritize those, and then make sure we get those all the way through to operationalizing them across the team is how you sort of unblock that problem.
What percentage of the companies that you're talking to have RevOps versus don't? And maybe the ones that don't, is it just is it marketing and sales, or is it the founder doing everything? Just to give us an orientation of this research.
Yeah, I mean, the research, it definitely looked across varying sizes of organizations. So certainly in smaller organizations, we are seeing like founder-led AI initiatives. So not every team had RevOps, but every team should have somebody kind of in charge of that more operationally minded strategy. And so even if it's not RevOps, it could be, we've seen where functional leaders have their own go-to-market engineer who's working with, let's say, marketing, right? The CMO has a go-to-market engineer or an ops person who is manning that, who understands the subject matter expertise of marketing, but also brings in a little bit of that technical understanding to figure out how to bring these things to life. And those two things are important. We're seeing a rise in interest in go-to-market engineers. I sort of think like whether you hire a go-to-market engineer or you just figure out who's that person internally who has that blend of that subject matter expertise or best practices business side and the technical side to be able to marry those two is what's needed. And that's just because the nature of go-to-market is you're not going to have those technical chops in every single person in your team. So you need to have somebody who's kind of runs point on that.
Could probably do an episode on, do we need a go-to-market engineer as a new title or do we not? We understand Clay has an entire new generation of folks that are being trained, but is it needed, or is this an evolution of RevOps? Are they creating a role specific for their tool? There are a lot of questions there. So maybe we spend a few more minutes and then I move on with a footnote of an episode coming right up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm bullish on go-to-market engineers. And when I talk about go-to-market engineers, I am talking about that person who is a little bit more technical, who blends the technical with the functional expertise. So ultimately, like say 5 years from now, as this function matures, I think it'll roll into RevOps. But I think a near-term step to that is rolling into the functional area. So just like you have marketing ops, even whether that rolls into RevOps or whether that rolls into the CMO, having somebody on that team who can be in charge of AI strategy, who can be thinking through agents as resources, just as you would be thinking about the people resources that you need to fill out your org chart, having somebody in charge of that is really critical. Because setting that up to determine, A, where we need them, like which are the 5 key areas where we need them, and then looking at things like, is this something we should build and maintain our own infrastructure around? Or is this something we need to go out and evaluate different solutions on? The build versus buy decision is a big one for a lot of organizations. Build is great to get started, and I think we've seen a lot of really cool DIY grassroots efforts, especially with the models and the capabilities that have been released with the models. But organizations inherently will have to figure out where it makes sense to build and where it makes sense to buy. We fundamentally believe it's not a build or buy, it's a build and buy. Because there will always, the simpler things you should absolutely build yourselves. You can't buy a tool for every tiny use case that you want to do. That would be too expensive. But as the use cases become a little more complex, you may choose to build or you may choose to buy from best of breed point solutions that have already thought through all the best practices and all the connections that you need. I think that continues to evolve as you continue to get more complex, and then we will see these custom build solutions reemerging for organizations that are trying to connect everything, and they really need something that is customized to their specific business operations and cadence. So I feel like the evolution is really interesting. It's build and buy, but at the low end it's build, and at the high end it's build. But there's a lot of opportunity in the middle to save yourself the infrastructure, the maintenance, the resource intensiveness of building by just buying some of those best of breed solutions.
There's even a question in my mind about the definition of build. Like when we say the word build, to me used to be build is you got to write code. If build today is what? Using an AI agent through building it through N8N? Is it about no code solution where you're connecting a few things? Is that build? Or are we saying the build is a lift beyond?
I think you'd be surprised. Build still includes basic things like prompts. I still see teams doing quite a bit by building their own internal prompt libraries or their own custom GPTs or gems or Claude projects. There's a lot that can get done before we ever get to even no code types of applications. Now, that works really well for use cases that are individual, where an individual is doing a thing repeatedly, so therefore let's not make them rewrite the prompt every single time. It also works really well on the department level, like a specific team. Like in marketing, we know where all of our stuff is and we can coordinate amongst our team. Where that starts to break down and where we do need somebody who is thinking through those connectors, things like N8N or Make or whatever you're using, whether you're creating your own apps internally, is when we start to cross functional lines. We need to make sure that all of our systems are connected, that we're exchanging information, and that we're potentially orchestrating from one team to another. That's where it gets a little more sophisticated. But teams can absolutely build on that low end and should build on that low end as much as they can with the basic solutions that are available. Once they cross over, I think is an apt place for considering that build versus buy conversation. Like that's where it gets more complicated. The infrastructure is more complicated. The skill set is more complicated. The maintenance is more complicated. And so we have to make that decision as to, do we want to have those types of resources that can maintain that? Or is that the point at which we go buy some of those point solutions? And there's a lot emerging that are highly valuable that just because you can build it doesn't mean you should, doesn't mean that it's going to be more cost effective too.
Yeah, we talked about it. I'm in that game too. We're working on a solution, and it's a lift. It's a major lift. But I'm glad I asked you about the build, and you included in the build the idea of creating the prompts, because there's a lift to just do that. So I'm glad I asked. Kristina, I want to talk a bit about the marketing to sales handoff and alignment. That has come up. I lost track of how many times. That's a personal passion of mine to look at that challenge. I think it's interesting to look at it from what have you seen in your research? Where do you see this go-to-market engineer play a role? What are some of the best practices that you've seen for companies take on this alignment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the alignment thing is age-old. It's a cats versus dogs, Venus versus Mars type of challenge. I was an analyst at Gartner and Topo before that, and it was a constant thing that came up. I think that what I'm seeing with AI that is really interesting is first, teams are getting their own house in order. It's an opportunity to turn the lens inward and figure out how we make sure that we're as insightful, we're as efficient, we're as productive in our outputs as possible. So, for example, in marketing, I'm seeing where we are scrutinizing what we would consider something we'd throw over the wall to sales. We're scrutinizing that qualification criteria. We're scrutinizing the sources and the insights and the signals that determine whether something's good. So turning that lens in first, I think, is really helpful, because that improves alignment overall. Where we have alignment issues is when we have disagreements around the things that are expected of each side of the fence. So that turning the lens in, I think, is actually a very helpful thing to driving better alignment. The second is with orchestration. I think there's a huge opportunity for AI to better orchestrate the things that ultimately became the things that fell through the cracks between teams. So as we hand off leads, and then a seller may not have time to get to them, or they've got other priorities, deals, of course, that we want them to close. Like, those were areas where alignment would again be stressed, because marketing is doing all this effort to build this pipe, this funnel of leads, and sales not making the most of it, even though they might have good reasons to, even though they might think it's because they're unqualified, even though all sorts of excuses came up. And so the orchestration helps us make sure that those things that people might have dropped before are not getting dropped. So things like AI SDRs, the first iteration, everybody was all hopped up on trying to make outbound 100% automated, until we realized, actually, no, like, human in the loop is really valuable, because it helps us make sure the humans are doing the part of that is most important to be done by a human, things that involve taste and judgment. Whereas AI can do all the mechanical tasks that were making that harder for the humans to have time to apply their taste and judgment. And so from an overall alignment perspective, I think that turning the lens in is really, really important first, and then making sure we're orchestrating so that we're catching all the things that made it hard for humans to that were causing them to drop things, right?
Mm-hmm. And looking at that orchestration and that alignment between marketing and sales, do you see that in the hands of the go-to-market engineer that sits above? Is there another role? What is the best practices of who should own that alignment between marketing and sales?
I think it's strategic. So I think it absolutely is on the C level. If you've got a CRO, that's great. Although CROs have always skewed sales. But I think that it's about those two teams having a strategic understanding of what each's responsibility is, and then the go-to-market engineer and potentially agents enact that agreement. They're the ones who ensure that those SLAs are met. They're the ones that are ensuring the quality bar is met. They're the ones providing proof points to those things and reporting on it so that we can get better at it.
Just going a little bit further, does it matter with product-led growth versus sales-led growth? Would your answer be the same? Because there's a lot of debate about chief revenue officers or should they come from a sales lens or a marketing lens, or should this be a growth lens, or does it depend PLG versus SLG? Like, do you have a point of view based on your research?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my analyst answer, which is it depends.
Yeah.
And it largely depends on the sales and marketing motions of that organization, on the business model, on the target market, enterprise versus SMB. I think there's a lot of factors. I mean, I'll answer this in terms of, we've had the same debate over the years of where does the SDR team live, sales or marketing? That answer has always depended as well. And so I think I'll use that as an analogy to answer your question, which is, first and foremost, that function should always go to the team that can spend the time to get the quality output that they want. Sometimes that means sales, because we want to have, our SDRs be the future bench of talent for our sales team. Sometimes that should be marketing, because it's about generating a certain quality of pipeline. Sometimes it's split, and our outbound lives in sales and our inbound lives in marketing. I think that, the same for PLG and sales-led motions is that if it's product-led and there are truly things that we are designing as an experience that are independent of humans, that might be something that best lives with a little more of a marketing focus. And then for sales-led, vice versa. So it's a little hard to answer that question exactly without a specific case in mind.
I totally get it.
I look at it as, what is the core outcome that we need from that organization, from that motion, from whatever it is, and then we design around that.
100 more questions, Kristina, but I'll ask, what else from the research that stands out for you that will be super relevant for our audience, primarily, of course, marketers?
Yeah, I would say one thing. One is to recognize that there are multiple phases of adoption around AI. We're still very much in phase one, which is the leveraging productivity. And I think, again, if you're not doing it, you should start doing it. But as we think about how to justify these various experiments and activities that we're doing to amp up our team's productivity, we need to be mindful of how we're measuring that. So we believe strongly that there are two new things that teams should start tracking. One is net new ARR per go-to-market, dollar of go-to-market expense. And the second is net new ARR per go-to-market employee. And that's really over time, we should be able to get there with less dollars and less people than we did before. And so you asked earlier, where should AI be applied? There are cases where if we're applying AI everywhere, we're actually going to cost more than the people would have cost to do the same thing. We have to constantly be evaluating that trade-off. So tracking those two metrics is key. I think another one that's interesting is the next phase is a whole set of new use cases that teams are barely dipping their toes into. So if everybody now is starting to use AI for productivity for things like researching, for crafting messaging, for creating content for our various social channels, all that is great. That's a great place to start. Those are, I would say, less complex, more individualized team use cases. That's a required stepping stone to then be able to look at something more advanced, which is things like analyzing campaigns to determine what actually makes a good campaign, what actually yields the results that we want. So we look at this next phase. If phase one is productivity, we look at phase two as intelligence. It's about, in phase one, it's about figuring out how we can get more quantity from the existing resources that we have, whether that be the teams, the people, et cetera, the dollars expense, more from that, higher quantity. Phase two is about improving the quality. So if we are doing things like freeing up time for sales reps, we need to now be thinking about how do we improve their ability to win deals. So phase two use cases might look like things like connecting to all of our call transcripts to do a couple of things. One is to coach sales reps, to give them good insights, specific insights on how to get better in every single call that they have. On the marketing side, it'd be taking those transcripts and identifying where are the gaps in our product roadmap that customers are really drilling in on, all that stuff that we used to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to agencies to do these spot studies, right? On strengths and weaknesses, wins and losses. We can now do that with AI. But it is a more advanced use case, and we kind of have to go through the evolution of learning that personal productivity, the capabilities on the individual and team level, before we can start imagining how we're going to do that more broadly across systems and data sets.
I love that. And for those who just listened to the previous episode, Ritu was on from Observe AI talking about how they take customer service call data and automatically enrich the CRMs in order to make it actionable to improve customer experience and all of the motions from marketing to sales. So spot on. Kristina, turning our attention from kind of the co-pilots, which I think is kind of table stakes level one, right, into intelligence, but do you see the AI agent development by teams already in motion? I know there's a lot of YouTube videos. Again, I go back to that, and there's just so much noise around AI agents. From our personal experience, starting to build one is not a little bit harder. It's kind of like building a house. You're building, no problem. You hire the folks and then you get it done. And then it's so many months over. It's over budget. Timelines are busted as you get into the depth of it. Do you see agents in production that are not the core product of the company, but it's in their marketing and sales and their growth motions?
I do. One of the things that I'm most excited about that I see teams doing is creating strategic versions of themselves. So CMOs, CROs, whoever it might be, creating what is effectively a digital right hand for yourself to be able to get better insights to move faster in the decisions that you make for the team. I think that's really incredible. So that would involve, that could be as simple as creating something like a custom GPT, all the way up through creating a more sophisticated chief of staff type agent that can go to all the different systems, analyze data, multi-step analysis to figure out the insights that you need to run your business. So I think that's a really interesting one. Again, that's within the team. Those are where we're turning the lens on ourselves. I am seeing folks doing, have agents in production for mechanical, I would say behind the scenes things. I'm seeing folks starting to test more customer facing agents, especially with some of the, like having a digital avatar on your website that represents your brand, that's effectively like your AI SDR, that is there to help customers whenever we need them. I think those are great. Those are a fairly low lift way to have AI agents provide value immediately. And there are great providers out there that do that. As far as building your own, this is why I think the evolution of phase 1 before phase 2 is so important. You have to really understand what you're signing up for when you're trying to build something.
Oh, yeah.
If you bite off something too complex too soon, A, you never get to the end of it because it's complicated, and you start to question whether or not it can really do what you want it to do. And B, I feel like there's this misunderstanding around how to string everything together. So where I see things really working well, when folks want to get all the way to having real agents. And by the way, I think a lot of people conflate agents and GPTs. There are more sophisticated implementations of custom GPTs or GEMs or Claude projects that are effectively acting like people think agents are, but they're not necessarily autonomous. I'm seeing less truly autonomous agents.
Great
and
clarification.
More of the like lightweight version, which is a beefy GPT, let's call it. Mm-hmm. And so what I think is interesting for folks that want to get there is to first start again with process. I think if AI has done anything, it has really stressed people to be able to articulate what it is they want done. And the teams that have had these discussions or the effort to document these things are going to get to value a lot faster with AI. Those that are riffing it and trying to iterate on that while trying to build something, you can do that. You can absolutely do that, but it requires a lot more dedication and stick-to-itedness to get there than it would if you already had some documented processes. And so I'm seeing teams take a step back first. Again, I mentioned time studies. I've seen teams literally say, we're not doing anything for 6 months. We're just going to document everything.
Wow.
We're going to make sure it's really clear what our process is. And these are some of these are larger organizations because they want to be mindful about the investment. But having a good understanding of what it is that we want done is the first motion. The second is, how can we test this in a way that builds trust and confidence with the team? Because if we jump from process to automation, there's a lack of trust in the output. And so if we then go to a more manual way, like it could be, I'll use the example of sales coaching. A great one is can we deliver insights to the reps that make them want to interact with coaching, like AI coaches? If we can, and they're starting to go, this is great, but I would like it this way, or this is great, but this is not quite true, we do it this way, we can refine that. And then once they start liking the consistency of that output, now when we automate it, there's inherently more trust in it when it's automated than if we had skipped all the way to automation, because we wouldn't have had that fine-tuning process. So the initial documentation, then the fine-tuning, and then automation is where I see that working best with agents.
Makes a ton of sense. And you can lose trust fast. Enough hallucinations
So
and the
fast.
team members are just frustrated and saying, stop pushing me to use AI. Go use AI. Take a look at the crap that's
right.
now spinning my wheels. Or worse. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and by the way, we have precedents for that. We have precedents in other tech evolutions. Like intent data went through this, where at first everybody loved the idea that somebody was going to magically apply some sort of automated scoring algorithm instead of us having to define the score. And magically out the other side, we were going to get only the prioritized leads. Well, what ended up happening was reps would poke at one little thing and say, yeah, but this is rated as a 95, but here's everything that's wrong with it. So now all of a sudden the black box isn't trusted. I don't know what happens in that box, so I'm inherently going to always double check it. And then we didn't save time. So we've been through that experience before. And so I would encourage folks, like, that's not an AI problem. Like, that is inherently a tech adoption problem that we have to make sure we don't skip over just because we think AI is so magical.
It isn't. I mean, I think that's the moment we're in now. Over the last, 9 to 12 months, my estimation is when, now it could be magical in the future, right? Where we're not, we'll leave along the future. I'm no longer interested in talking about anything beyond a certain, a year out, maybe at most. Even that's a stretch. But in this moment in time, it's certainly a tool, a very robust tool. It could do a lot, but we need to be very precise. And the way you're describing it, getting the flow, the processes down first before raising the question of what's next. Makes a ton of sense. Kristina, if there were a couple actions that the listeners could take like this week, right? And they're not new to AI, they're not advanced. They're somewhere just doing the basics with it. What are the couple actions? And I'm going to take off the table creating the process, because I think we got them to think about the process. So what else could they do?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to that chief of staff. I have seen incredible breakthroughs with C-suite folks by literally creating a digital copy of yourself. So the task that you should go do is, I want you to create a master prompt. This is a prompt where you basically write down your job. So let's take the role of a CMO. You'd write down and articulate what your role is, what your company does, and where your strengths and weaknesses of your team are today. And it could be, your positioning in the market, whatever it is. And you use that to then try to figure out how to strategically orient your priorities around anything your team is doing. So it could be, I was talking to someone the other day who created this type of chief of staff to figure out how they were going to stand out more with their campaign efforts. They are in a very noisy market. It's very noisy on social media, even though it's B2B. And so they just feel like none of their campaign efforts are standing out. So this particular CMO is like, I need to figure out how to help us stand out. Should we do thought leadership? Should we do more of this, that, and the other? And all of these things involve choices. Even though AI helps get that stuff done faster, it also creates a lot more stuff to do. And so they used it to help pinpoint the specific thing that they wanted to go do with a logical justification that helped rally that person's team to that plan. Now, that doesn't seem that different than what a CMO might do anyway. However, the ability to get there that much faster was critical. I've also seen CMOs take things like their board decks and put it through, if they had, certain data and they wanted to figure out, like, what is it here? What am I really trying to say here? They might use AI to be their testing ground for important strategic plans or conversations. So there's just so many things you can do. So I think creating that chief of staff with that master prompt around what your job is and what the key things that you're trying to break through on are really important for go-to-market leaders. The next one is thinking about this intelligence phase. Again, like you said, most of them are probably using it for productivity. Let's start thinking about 1 or 2 use cases where we can get really, really smart with AI's help. So things like what insights do we not have that would be really helpful to have? Looking at how AI might get you those insights faster. So for some, it could be things like the win-loss types of feedback loops could be really meaningful. For others, I've seen them do voice of the customer, which is, I'm going to feed in a whole bunch of customer interviews or case study interviews or even just calls with customers to figure out, like, what are the things that I can take from that to make my marketing efforts even more timely, relevant, and fresh. So I think voice of the customer is another really exciting one. There's some cool things folks have done tactically with even creating agents that are the personas that they sell to and using that to test messaging. I think that one's also really powerful. So again, it's not going to be perfect in every time, but the issue is you have so many most folks in their ICP have multiple types of personas still, multiple industries. And when we take a generic approach, we're missing the nuances that make them special. So being able to create personas that are narrowed down to like 2 or 3 clicks down to the level of specificity for our personas can be really powerful for teasing out what's really going to get people to respond, especially today, because I'm finding connect rates are down across teams, reply rates are down. Everything is down because we're just inundated. And so figuring out how to get that more specific, more relevant, timely, fresh message is critical. So those are some of the use cases that I think folks should explore.
Fantastic. A couple of those I've already played with. A few are new to me. Those are going to be my actions for the week. Kristina, we delivered on breaking news. Thank you for sharing the research. Thank you for your time. And let's stay in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Over and out.